Welcome to the mystical tales of a tiring and stressful day. Before you close your eyes tonight, allow yourself this moment of silence. Take a slow, gentle breath, draw the air deep into your lungs, and then exhale just as slowly. Let all the tension of the day gently flow away from your shoulders, neck, and jaw. There is nothing to do now, nowhere to go. The hours ahead are entirely dedicated to rest, to gently drifting towards sleep, which only asks you to allow it to come. Allow your body to settle more deeply into the comfort of your bed, feel the weight of the blankets, the support beneath you, how everything around you comes together to hold you securely throughout the night. Tonight's journey will be a quiet one, a slow walk along a modest canal in Victorian England, where the evening settles with a particular stillness, where modest homes stand in patient rows beside the water, their windows glowing softly against the gathering dusk. There will be no urgency here, no drama, only the gentle observations of an unhurried stroll, the kind of walk taken simply for the sake of walking, for breathing the cooling air, for noticing the small details that the day's work does not permit. Let yourself imagine you are there now, your footsteps measured and calm along the towpath, as we begin. The canal stretched before him in a long straight line, its surface holding the last pale remnants of daylight with an almost liquid stillness that seemed to thicken the very air above it. This was the hour when the factories fell quiet, when the mills along the Manchester tributaries ceased their clattering, when the bargemen tied their narrow boats to the worn bollards and retreated to the small cabins built into the sterns, lighting lamps that would burn through the coming night. The year was somewhere in the 1870s, though the exact date mattered little along this particular stretch of waterway, where time moved according to older rhythms, measured not by factory whistles but by the rising and falling of the sun, by the gradual deepening of shadows across the brick facades that lined both banks. He walked slowly, his boots finding the familiar unevenness of the towpath without conscious thought, the packed earth worn smooth by decades of horses pulling their loads, by the feet of lock-keepers and their families, by workers making their way home at this same hour, day after day, year following year. The path was perhaps 4 feet wide, sometimes narrowing where the bank had settled or where weeds had claimed a few inches at the edges, and it ran parallel to the canal with such steadiness that one could walk for a mile or more without the need to watch one's footing, the mind free to wander as the body moved forward through the cooling evening air. The homes that stood along the far bank were modest structures, built of red brick that had weathered to a soft, muted tone, their roofs pitched steeply and covered in slate that gleamed faintly where the last light touched. They were workers' cottages, most of them, 2 stories high with small windows set into walls that showed the economy of their construction, no ornament wasted, no space given over to anything that did not serve a practical purpose. Each cottage stood perhaps 20 feet from its neighbor, separated by narrow passages that led to back gardens, to shared yards, to the small necessities of daily life that remained hidden from the canal's view. The front doors opened directly onto a narrow street that ran parallel to the canal, and from his position on the towpath, he could see only the backs of these dwellings, the kitchen windows mostly, and the occasional bedroom window on the upper floor. The reflections in the water held his attention more completely than the buildings themselves. The canal's surface had become a mirror in the still evening, and every structure along the far bank appeared twice, once in brick and slate rising solidly above the waterline, and once again in a softer, wavering form that seemed to extend downward into impossible depths. The reflected windows glowed with a warmer light than their originals, the slight movement of the water adding a gentle pulse to each golden rectangle, as though the reflections breathed while the buildings themselves remained perfectly still. He had walked this path many times, at many different hours, but the evening brought a quality of light that transformed the familiar into something worth noticing again, worth the slow attention that his pace allowed. A cottage 3 doors along had lit a lamp in its ground floor window, and the light spilled out across the small patch of earth between the building and the water's edge, illuminating what appeared to be a kitchen garden, the shapes of cabbage leaves visible even at this distance, their broad flat surfaces catching the lamplight. The reflection of this window stretched down into the canal, a column of warm yellow that trembled very slightly, disturbed perhaps by the movement of some fish below the surface, or by the faint current that persisted even in water that appeared entirely still. He slowed his pace further, almost stopping, watching how the reflection maintained its general shape even as its edges softened and reformed, a continuous gentle motion that seemed to breathe in time with the evening itself. The air had cooled considerably since the afternoon, though it retained a softness that spoke of the season, late summer perhaps, or early autumn, when the heat of the day lingered in the brick and stone but no longer pressed down with the weight it had carried in July. A faint smell of coal smoke drifted from the chimneys, mixing with the green, slightly muddy scent of the canal water, with the smell of damp stone and weathered wood. These were the smells of home for those who lived along this stretch, so familiar as to be barely noticed, but to him, walking the towpath with no particular destination, they formed a kind of atmosphere that wrapped around his awareness, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply present, simply part of the character of this place at this hour. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of voices from within one of the cottages, a woman's voice raised slightly as though calling someone to supper, followed by the lighter response of a child. The sounds carried across the water with surprising clarity in the evening quiet, though the words themselves remained indistinct, transformed by distance and the acoustic properties of the canal into a gentle murmur that seemed almost musical, a human contribution to the subtle soundscape of the evening. A moment later, a man's deeper voice joined briefly, and then all three fell silent again, absorbed back into whatever domestic routine unfolded beyond the brick walls and small windows. The towpath continued its steady line ahead of him, disappearing into the gradual dimming of the evening perhaps half a mile distant, where the canal curved slightly to accommodate the landscape, bending around what might have been a rise in the land or an ancient property boundary. He resumed his slow walk, feeling the rhythm of his steps, the slight give of the earth beneath his boots, the way each footfall seemed to settle into place before he lifted the other foot, creating a measured pace that asked nothing of his muscles, no effort, only continuation, only the gentle forward motion that walking at such a speed required. Along the opposite bank, another window came to life, the flare of a match visible for the briefest moment before a lamp was lit, its glow spreading slowly through what appeared to be a parlor, judging by the position of the window slightly above the ground level. The reflection appeared in the water almost immediately, though it took several seconds for the light to reach its full brightness, the flame in the lamp finding its strength, steadying itself against the glass chimney. This second reflection joined the first, 2 golden rectangles now stretching down into the depths of the canal, separated by perhaps 50 feet, creating a kind of visual rhythm along the water's surface that would multiply as more lamps were lit in the cottages ahead. The process of lighting the evening lamps was one that unfolded gradually along the canal, not all at once, but dwelling by dwelling as each family reached the point in their evening routine when the natural light no longer sufficed for whatever tasks remained. He had noticed this before, this gentle cascade of illumination that began in some cottages earlier than others, reflecting different schedules, different priorities, the varied patterns of life lived in structures that appeared so uniform from the outside. A household with small children might light their lamps earlier, needing the light for preparing supper, for tending to the needs of the young ones before they were put to bed. A household of adults alone might wait longer, conserving the oil or gas, making use of every last moment of natural light before committing to the expense of artificial illumination. The water beside him made almost no sound, its surface disturbed only by the occasional small circle that appeared where an insect touched down, or where something beneath the surface exhaled a bubble of air that rose and broke with the faintest pop. The canal had been cut more than 80 years earlier, part of the great expansion of waterways that had transformed the industrial north of England, connecting Manchester to Liverpool, Birmingham to London, creating the arteries through which coal and cotton and manufactured goods could flow more efficiently than the roads had ever allowed. By the 1870s, the canals had already begun their slow decline in commercial importance, challenged by the railways that could move goods faster, though the waterways remained in use, still serving the needs of local industry, still providing employment for the bargemen and their families who lived aboard the narrow boats, still shaping the geography and daily life of the neighborhoods through which they passed. The cottages along this stretch had been built specifically to house workers from the nearby mill, which stood about a quarter-mile distant, its chimney visible above the roofline of the dwellings, a tall brick column that had ceased its usual dark exhalation of smoke now that the working day had ended. The mill owner had commissioned these cottages in the 1850s, recognizing that a stable workforce required stable housing, and the canal's edge had provided convenient land, relatively inexpensive, with the added benefit of being within easy walking distance of the mill gates. The construction had been economical but not shoddy, the brickwork solid, the roofs properly slated, the spaces between buildings sufficient to prevent the kind of overcrowding that characterized some of the older workers housing in the city centers. Each cottage contained, as far as he understood, a front parlor and a back kitchen on the ground floor, with 2 bedrooms above, reached by a narrow staircase that rose from near the kitchen. The parlor would have a cast-iron range for heating, while the kitchen might have a smaller stove for cooking, though in many households both functions were combined in a single range, which served as the heart of the home, providing warmth, enabling the preparation of meals, heating water, drying clothes, creating the perpetual low heat that made these spaces habitable even in the depths of winter. The privies stood in the backyards, shared between several cottages, an arrangement that remained common despite the gradual improvements in sanitation that were beginning to reach even modest neighborhoods such as this. A third window illuminated across the water, this one on the upper floor of a cottage that stood slightly closer to the canal than its neighbors, its small garden extending almost to the water's edge. The reflection of this window appeared higher in the water's mirror, creating a different angle, adding variety to the pattern of golden lights that now marked the far bank. He could see, dimly, the shape of a curtain being drawn across this upper window, a woman's silhouette visible briefly before the curtain obscured the interior, though the light continued to glow softly through the thin fabric. The reflected light seemed to pulse slightly more than the others, perhaps because of the curtain's movement, or perhaps because the water itself moved differently at this point, responding to some irregularity in the canal bed, some stone or submerged timber that created subtle variations in the current. The evening had reached that particular stage where color began to drain from the world, where the brick of the cottages no longer showed its red warmth but appeared increasingly gray, where the green of the occasional tree or bush that grew along the banks faded into darker, less distinct tones. The sky above still held light, a pale luminous quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sufficient to see clearly but no longer sufficient to read by, no longer sufficient for work that required attention to detail. This was the hour when outdoor tasks were abandoned, when children were called inside, when the separation between the working day and the domestic evening became most pronounced. He passed a place where the towpath widened slightly, accommodating a wooden bench that someone had placed there years ago, its surface worn smooth by weather and by the generations of people who had sat there, watching the water, resting during a walk, pausing in whatever journey had brought them along this route. The bench faced the canal, giving whoever sat there a view across the water to the cottages beyond, and he stopped now, standing beside it rather than sitting, looking across at the increasing number of lit windows, at their reflections multiplying in the darkening water, at the way the scene appeared to settle into itself as the transition from day to evening completed its slow, inevitable progress. The stillness was not absolute. Behind him, from the direction of the street that ran parallel to the towpath on his side of the canal, he could hear the sound of a horse's hooves, a slow, tired rhythm that spoke of a day's labor completed, of a carter making his way home with an empty wagon. The sound grew slightly louder, then faded again, moving away along the street, absorbed back into the larger quietness that characterized this hour. Somewhere more distant, a dog barked 3 times, then stopped, as if having delivered whatever warning or greeting it felt necessary. A bird called from the roof of one of the cottages, a sound he could not identify, a single sharp note repeated twice before silence returned. The quality of the reflections continued to fascinate him, the way they seemed more vivid now than the buildings themselves, more worthy of attention, as though the canal's surface had become the primary reality and the actual structures merely shadows cast upward into the air. The water held the light with a kind of tenderness, transforming the harsh geometry of windows and walls into something softer, more forgiving, more beautiful in its imperfection. He knew that if he were to throw a stone into the water, the reflections would shatter into 1,000 fragments, dancing and reforming as the ripples spread outward, but the thought of disturbing the scene held no appeal. The stillness itself had value, was worth preserving, worth protecting through his own careful immobility. A cottage near the end of the visible row showed no light at all, its windows dark rectangles against the brick, and he wondered briefly whether it stood empty, unoccupied, or whether its inhabitants simply had not yet returned from wherever their day's work had taken them. Sometimes families took employment at different locations, husbands at one mill, wives at another, children apprenticed to trades that required them to lodge elsewhere during the week, returning only on Sundays. Such arrangements, though they strained the bonds of family life, remained common among the working poor, who could not afford to refuse employment wherever it might be found, who needed every possible source of income to meet the weekly rent, to keep food on the table, to maintain the fragile stability that separated them from the workhouse and its indignities. The air seemed to be growing cooler minute by minute, though the change was so gradual as to be barely perceptible, noticed only when he became aware that his hands, hanging at his sides, had begun to feel the chill, that the exposed skin of his face registered a slight tightening as the temperature dropped. Autumn was approaching, bringing with it the longer nights, the earlier dusks, the gradual transition toward winter that would transform this same walk into a considerably less comfortable experience, when ice might glaze the towpath and make each step treacherous, when the canal itself might freeze over in the coldest weather, its surface no longer reflecting but covering, hiding, sealing away the depths beneath a white crust that children from the cottages would test with thrown stones, watching to see if the ice held or cracked. But that was weeks away still, perhaps months, and tonight the temperature remained mild enough that walking required no particular fortitude, no hunching of shoulders against the wind, no quickening of pace to generate warmth. He could stand here indefinitely, watching the light fade, watching more windows illuminate across the water, noting the small variations in their reflections, the different qualities of light that suggested different kinds of lamps, oil lamps versus gas lamps, new lamps versus old, well-maintained wicks versus those that needed trimming, all these small differences visible to someone who took the time to observe, who had no pressing appointment waiting, no obligation pulling him forward into The darkening evening. A woman emerged from one of the cottages, visible in silhouette against the lit kitchen window as she opened the back door and stepped out into what appeared to be the garden area. She moved with purpose, walking toward what must have been the privy, her skirts gathered slightly to navigate the uneven ground, her figure growing less distinct as she moved away from the light spilling through the open door. He watched without meaning to intrude on her privacy, simply registering the movement, the brief animation in a scene that had been entirely still for several minutes. She disappeared from view behind an outbuilding, and a moment later the light from the kitchen window dimmed slightly as someone inside pulled a curtain partway across, restoring privacy to the interior while still allowing some illumination to escape. The path ahead continued its steady line, and after another moment of standing beside the bench, he resumed walking, his pace unchanged, the rhythm of his steps falling back into their measured pattern. The sounds of his boots on the packed earth seemed louder now, more distinct in the deepening quiet, each footfall a small announcement of his presence, though there was no one nearby to hear, no one watching from the cottages across the water, whose occupants were absorbed in their own concerns, their own evening routines, their own small worlds contained within brick walls and lit by lamps that pushed back against the approaching darkness. The canal curved gently ahead, bending perhaps 10 degrees to the left, following the contour of land that had been shaped by centuries of agricultural use before the waterway had been cut through it. The curve was so gradual that it barely registered as a change in direction, merely a softening of the straight line, an accommodation to geography that the canal engineers had deemed more practical than forcing the water to maintain an absolutely rigid course. He followed the towpath as it traced this curve, and as he did so, a new section of the canal revealed itself, another quarter-mile of water stretching ahead, lined on the far side by a continuation of the same row of modest cottages, their architectural uniformity creating a rhythm that seemed to extend indefinitely into the gathering dusk. More windows had been lit during the minutes since he had last looked carefully at the far bank, and now perhaps a dozen golden rectangles glowed along the row, their reflections creating a corresponding parade of lights in the water below. The effect was quite beautiful in its simplicity, in the way it transformed the utilitarian into something almost decorative, though he doubted the cottage dwellers thought of their evening lamps in such terms. These vessels, designed specifically for the narrow canals of England, measured perhaps 70 feet in length but only 7 feet in width, their dimensions determined by the width of the locks through which they had to pass. This particular boat appeared to be laden with cargo, riding low enough in the water that its gunwale stood only a foot or so above the surface, and he could see, as he drew closer, that the cargo was covered with a heavy tarpaulin, lashed down securely against weather and theft. The stern of the boat showed a small cabin, barely 8 feet long, within which the bargeman and his family would live, sleeping, eating, conducting the entirety of their domestic existence in a space that most people would consider insufficient even for storage. No light showed from the cabin's small windows, and no smoke rose from the chimney pipe that protruded from the cabin roof, suggesting that the occupants had either not yet returned from wherever their evening had taken them, or had perhaps already retired for the night, though this seemed unlikely given the relatively early hour. More probably, he thought, the bargeman had gone into the nearby town to conduct some business, to purchase supplies, to arrange the next cargo, to engage in whatever commercial negotiations kept the boat in operation and the family fed. The life of a canal family was one of constant movement, of traveling the waterways from one destination to another, of knowing dozens of towns and villages without truly belonging to any of them, of existing in a state of permanent transience that set them apart from the settled populations who watched them pass. He walked slowly past the moored boat, noting the careful maintenance evident in its condition, the fresh paint on the cabin despite its weathering, the neatly coiled ropes, the orderliness that suggested pride in the vessel despite the hardship of the life it represented. The name painted on the stern was difficult to read in the failing light, but he thought he could make out the word Providence, a common enough name for canal boats, reflecting the reliance of their owners on divine favor to keep them safe, to provide cargo, to sustain them through the various perils of their trade. The boat's hull, he noticed, showed the marks of many passages through locks, the scratches and scrapes that accumulated over years of negotiating the narrow stone chambers, the paint worn away in places where the boat had rubbed against lock gates or canal walls. Beyond the boat, the towpath resumed its character as a simple packed earth track, bordered on the water side by a slight drop to the canal's edge, and on the land side by a low hedge that separated the path from the field beyond. This field appeared to be fallow, the stubble of some harvested crop visible as darker lines against the lighter earth, creating a pattern that repeated itself across the entire visible expanse. The field stretched away to his right, rising slightly toward a distant tree line that marked either a property boundary or the edge of a small wood. No building stood in that direction, no lights punctuated the darkness that was gathering there more quickly than along the canal, where the water still held some reflection of the sky's remaining luminosity. Another cottage window illuminated across the canal, and then another, the sequence continuing as though each household followed some unspoken schedule, each lighting their lamps at the precise moment when their particular circumstances demanded it. He tried to imagine the interiors of these cottages, the families gathered in their small parlors or around their kitchen tables, the mothers preparing suppers from whatever ingredients they had managed to afford, the fathers perhaps reading newspapers if they possessed the literacy and the expenditure on such material seemed justified, the children playing quiet games or helping with whatever tasks their ages permitted them to perform. These imaginings were speculative, of course, based on his general knowledge of working-class domestic life rather than on any specific information about these particular households, but the images formed themselves nonetheless, giving human dimension to the anonymous windows and their reflections. The quality of the light had changed again during the past several minutes, the sky transitioning from its pale luminous gray into something darker, something that approached but had not yet become true night. The horizon still showed a faint band of lighter tone where the last traces of sunset persisted, though even this was fading rapidly, being absorbed into the general darkening that would soon make the canal and its surroundings difficult to navigate without the aid of a lantern. He had not brought a lantern, having anticipated that he would turn back before full darkness fell, that he would retrace his steps along the towpath while enough light remained to see the unevenness of the ground, to avoid the occasional stone or root that might cause a stumble. But the act of turning back required a decision, a conscious choice to end this gentle perambulation, and he found himself reluctant to make it, preferring instead to continue forward a little longer, to see what the next stretch of canal might reveal, to extend this interval of quiet observation before returning to whatever obligations awaited him in the town he had left behind. There was something deeply calming about this slow progress along the water's edge, something that answered a need he had not fully recognized until he found himself here, walking without destination, watching the evening settle over this modest landscape with its patient, unhurried transformation of day into night. A sound reached him from across the water, the sharp metallic clang of a pot or pan being set down, followed immediately by a woman's voice calling something he could not quite distinguish, the words blurred by distance and the acoustic properties of the space between him and the cottages. A child's voice responded, higher in pitch, more animated, and then another voice joined, creating a brief cacophony of domestic communication before all three fell silent again, absorbed back into the privacy of their household, leaving only the sound of their lives continuing beyond the walls, audible but not comprehensible, present but separate from his solitary passage along the towpath. The reflections in the water had multiplied to the point where they created an almost continuous band of golden light along the far side of the canal, broken only by the dark gaps where cottages had not yet lit their lamps, or where no cottage stood, or where trees or outbuildings interrupted the line of dwellings. These gaps gave rhythm to the band of light, preventing it from becoming monotonous, creating a pattern that the eye could follow and find interesting despite its essential simplicity. He noticed that where the water's surface showed the slightest movement, the reflections elongated, stretching downward into wavering columns that seemed to reach toward impossible depths, while where the water remained perfectly still, the reflections maintained sharper edges, more clearly defined rectangles that appeared almost solid, as though one could reach down and touch them, feel the warmth of the light they represented. The temperature continued its gradual decline, and he became aware of the first real chill in the air, a quality that suggested autumn more definitively than the earlier coolness had done. The brick of the cottages would be radiating the heat they had absorbed during the day, creating a slightly warmer microclimate along the far bank, while here on the towpath, exposed to whatever slight breeze moved across the open field, the cooling proceeded more rapidly. He did not mind particularly. The chill was not uncomfortable, merely present, a sensory detail that added to his awareness of the evening, to his sense of being out of doors at this transitional hour, neither day nor night, when the world seemed to pause between one state and another. A bat flickered past, visible for only a second against the slightly lighter sky, its erratic flight path taking it out over the canal and then back toward the far bank, pursuing whatever insects hovered above the water's surface. The appearance of the bat marked another stage in the evening's progression, another small sign of the day's complete surrender to night, as the diurnal creatures retreated and the nocturnal ones emerged to claim their territory. He watched the space where the bat had been, wondering if it would return, but saw nothing further, the creature having moved on to hunt elsewhere along the canal, following its own mysterious route through the darkness. His pace had slowed even further, he realized, until he was walking at barely more than a drift, each step following the previous one with a languid inevitability that suggested he might continue in this manner indefinitely, that he might walk until his body simply stopped of its own accord, exhausted not by effort but by the cumulative effect of hours of gentle motion. But this was foolish thinking, he knew. Soon he would need to turn back, to retrace his steps to wherever he had begun this walk, to return to the obligations and routines that structured his life outside these quiet interludes. Yet not quite yet. A little further. Just to see what lay beyond the next bend in the canal, where the towpath appeared to narrow again, where a small stone bridge arched over the water, barely visible now in the deepening gloom. The bridge emerged more clearly as he approached, revealing itself as a modest structure built from the same weathered brick as the cottages, its single arch spanning the canal at a height that would allow even a laden narrow boat to pass beneath without difficulty. The bridge carried what appeared to be a farm track or minor road, connecting fields on either side of the waterway, and its presence here suggested that the canal had cut through pre-existing pathways, necessitating these crossings to maintain the agricultural routines that had shaped this landscape long before the waterway engineers had arrived with their surveys and calculations. The stonework of the arch showed the marks of time and weather, the mortar between the bricks darkened by moisture and moss, the edges softened by decades of frost and rain working upon the surface. He paused beneath the bridge, standing in the deeper shadow cast by its arch, looking up at the curved underside where the bricks had been laid in careful progression, each course following the geometric demands of the arch's shape. The engineering required to build such structures, Even simple ones like this, represented knowledge accumulated over centuries, passed down through generations of craftsmen who understood how forces distributed themselves through curves, how weight could be supported by compression alone, how permanence could be achieved through proper construction even when using materials as humble as fired clay. The bridge had likely stood here for 50 years or more, serving its purpose without complaint, allowing carts and foot traffic to cross while the canal traffic passed beneath, two systems of movement intersecting without interference. From this vantage point, standing still in the shadow of the arch, the view back along the canal revealed the full extent of the illumination that had accumulated during his walk. The row of lit windows stretched into the distance, their reflections creating a double line of golden points that seemed to converge toward some distant vanishing point, growing closer together as perspective compressed them, until the furthest ones appeared as mere pinpricks of light, barely distinguishable from their reflections. The scene possessed a quality that reminded him of paintings he had seen, those careful depictions of evening landscapes where artists attempted to capture the exact quality of fading light, the precise relationship between illumination and shadow. But no painting could fully capture what he saw now, the living quality of it, the way each window's light pulsed ever so slightly with the movements of the people within, the way the reflections responded to every minute disturbance of the water's surface. He emerged from beneath the bridge, resuming his slow walk along the towpath, which continued ahead into what was now approaching true darkness. The sky retained only the faintest suggestion of light, a deep blue-gray that would soon transition into black, and the individual features of the landscape were beginning to merge into undifferentiated masses, shapes without detail, presence without specificity. The cottages ahead remained visible primarily because of their windows, which served as markers, points of reference in an increasingly featureless expanse. Without these lights, he thought, navigation would become difficult, the towpath itself barely visible, the canal's edge unmarked and potentially dangerous for someone who did not know the route intimately. Another stretch of cottages came into view as the canal completed its gentle curve, and he saw that this section showed a slightly different character from the earlier ones. These buildings appeared marginally larger, perhaps 3 stories rather than 2, and the spacing between them suggested plots of slightly greater size. The windows here included some with shutters, visible even in the dim light as darker rectangles framing the illuminated glass, and one cottage showed what appeared to be a small conservatory or glass extension attached to its side, an architectural feature that indicated a household of somewhat greater means, though still far from wealthy by any standard that mattered in the broader economy of Victorian England. The reflection of this larger cottage stretched further down into the canal's depths, its 3 stories creating a more imposing presence in the water's mirror than the humbler 2-story structures had managed. The windows on its upper floors showed curtains that appeared to be of better quality than those he had glimpsed in the earlier cottages, the fabric hanging in fuller folds, suggesting more material, perhaps even a deliberate decorative intention rather than purely functional coverage. He could see, through one of these upper windows, the silhouette of someone moving, a figure passing from one side of the room to the other, pausing briefly at the window as though looking out, though from this distance and in this light he could discern nothing about the person except the general shape, the indication of human presence. The towpath here showed signs of more careful maintenance than in the previous stretches, the surface more level, the edges more clearly defined, with what appeared to be stones laid along the canal side to prevent erosion. This attention to upkeep suggested either a more conscientious landowner or perhaps the proximity of the lockkeeper's cottage, whose occupant would have responsibility for maintaining the towpath within his jurisdiction. Lockkeepers took pride in their stretches of canal, in the smooth operation of their locks, in the tidiness of the grounds around their cottages, seeing themselves as stewards of a small but important domain, and this pride often manifested in visible improvements to the immediate environment. Indeed, as he continued forward, he saw ahead the outline of the lock itself, the two sets of gates barely visible as darker lines against the water, the chamber between them creating a slight disruption in the canal's otherwise level surface. The lockkeeper's cottage stood beside the lock, a structure slightly larger and more substantial than the workers' cottages, with a small garden extending from its front door to the towpath's edge. This garden showed signs of careful tending even in the diminished light, with what appeared to be rows of vegetables, perhaps cabbages or turnips, and the dark shapes of what might have been bean poles standing in ordered ranks. A lamp burned in the cottage's lower window, and another in a window upstairs, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney, suggesting an evening fire burning comfortably, warming the interior against the advancing chill. He approached the lock slowly, mindful of the changes in level, of the gates and their mechanisms, of the various bollards and cleats that would present obstacles to an inattentive walker. The locked chamber itself appeared to be empty, no boat occupying the space between the gates, the water lying perhaps 8 or 9 feet below the upper level of the canal. The gates at the far end, the lower gates, showed the careful painting that indicated recent maintenance, the wood protected against rot by layers of tar or pitch that gleamed faintly in whatever light reached them. The balance beams, those long arms that extended from each gate and allowed a single person to open the heavy wooden structures, rested against their stops, angled upward slightly, waiting for the next boat that would require passage. The lockkeeper emerged from his cottage as the walker approached, a man of perhaps 50 years, wearing a waistcoat over his shirt sleeves despite the evening chill, his sleeves rolled to his elbows as though he had just completed some task that required freedom of movement. He carried no lantern, apparently content to rely on the ambient light that remained, or perhaps so familiar with his surroundings that he needed no artificial aid to navigate safely. He nodded a greeting, a brief acknowledgement of the walker's presence, then moved toward the locked gates with the economical movements of someone who had performed the same actions thousands of times, checking something about the gate mechanism, running his hand along a beam, testing its security or condition. The walker returned the nod but did not speak, understanding that there was no need for conversation, that the lockkeeper's gesture had fulfilled the requirements of courtesy without inviting further interaction. The silence between them felt entirely natural, two men occupying the same space for a moment, each engaged in their own concerns, neither requiring anything from the other. After a moment, the lockkeeper completed his inspection and returned to his cottage, pausing at the door to look once more across the canal, his gaze perhaps checking the water level, looking for approaching boats, or simply taking a moment to observe the evening as it settled over his domain. Then he went inside, and the door closed behind him, and the walker was alone again with the canal and the gathering darkness. The stretch of canal beyond the lock appeared to narrow slightly, or perhaps this was merely an effect of the reduced light, the way darkness compressed distances and altered perceptions. The cottages continued on the far bank, their windows fewer now, the intervals between them greater, suggesting that this section was less densely inhabited, or perhaps that some of the dwellings stood empty, casualties of the gradual economic shifts that affected all industrial neighborhoods, as workers moved to seek employment elsewhere, as mills closed or reduced their operations, as the intricate web of commerce that supported these communities underwent its constant, often painful, rearrangements. One cottage stood completely dark, its windows empty rectangles against the brick, no reflection appearing in the water below. The garden before it showed signs of neglect, the shapes of what might have been weeds growing unchecked, visible even in the poor light as a general disorder that contrasted with the neat plots of the occupied dwellings. Whether this cottage stood temporarily empty or had been abandoned entirely was impossible to determine from this distance, but its darkness seemed more complete than that of a dwelling whose occupants had simply not yet returned home, a quality of absence that suggested longer duration, a severing of the connection between building and human habitation. He found himself wondering about the people who had lived there, what circumstances had driven them away, whether they had left voluntarily in search of better prospects or whether poverty had forced them out, unable to meet the weekly rent, falling into that spiral of debt and desperation that claimed so many working families. The cottage itself remained solid enough, the structure showing no obvious signs of decay or damage, suggesting that its emptiness was recent, that it had not yet had time to deteriorate in the way that abandoned buildings inevitably did once the constant attention of occupants ceased to protect them against weather and time. The air had grown distinctly colder now, and he could see his breath forming brief clouds before dissipating, visible against the slightly lighter background of the water when he happened to exhale while looking in that direction. His hands, which had been merely cool earlier, now felt genuinely chilled, and he tucked them into his coat pockets, a gesture that seemed to signal an acknowledgement that the evening had progressed beyond the comfortable stage, that soon the cold would become not merely present but insistent, demanding either retreat to somewhere warmer or acceptance of genuine discomfort. Yet still he continued forward, drawn by some quality of the scene that he could not quite name, some combination of the visual beauty of the reflected lights and the profound quiet that had settled over everything. The towpath curved again, following the canal's bend around what appeared to be a small rise in the land, and as he followed this curve, the perspective shifted, revealing yet another section of the waterway stretching ahead. This new vista showed fewer cottages, the buildings more widely spaced, with darker intervals between them where no structures stood at all, where the far bank appeared to be given over to scrubland or rough pasture. The reduction in human habitation brought with it a corresponding reduction in light, and the reflections in the water became more isolated, individual points of illumination separated by long stretches of darkness, creating a different pattern, one that suggested the gradual transition from settled neighborhood to countryside, from the densely inhabited margins of the town to the emptier spaces beyond. He noticed that the character of the remaining cottages had changed as well. These were older structures, he thought, their brickwork less uniform, their rooflines showing the slight sagging that came with age, with the settling of foundations, with the slow yielding of timber to the weight it supported. One cottage showed a chimney that had been repaired at some point, the newer bricks visible as a lighter patch against the weathered original, and another displayed windows that did not quite align with each other, suggesting that they had been added or altered at different times, following no coherent plan but responding to practical needs as they arose. The lamp burning in the nearest of these older cottages cast a warmer light than those he had observed earlier, a more yellow-orange glow that suggested an oil lamp rather than gas, the flame visible through the window as a small bright point around which the rest of the light seemed to gather. The reflection of this particular window stretched down into the canal with exceptional clarity, the water here being unusually still, creating an image so sharp that it appeared almost solid, as though the light itself had taken physical form and extended beneath the surface. He stopped walking to observe this reflection more carefully, watching how it maintained its stability despite the slow movement of the water, how it seemed to pulse very gently with what might have been the flickering of the lamp's flame, transmitted through the window glass and across the intervening space and down into the depths with such fidelity that he could almost believe he was seeing two separate lamps, one in the cottage and one suspended in the water below. The silence had deepened to the point where small sounds became more noticeable. The faint lapping of water against the canal bank, barely audible, more felt than heard, a whisper of liquid movement that provided a constant background to the evening's quiet. The settling of earth along the towpath, tiny adjustments that produced occasional small clicks or rustles as stones shifted their positions, finding new equilibrium. His own breathing, steady and calm, creating its brief clouds in the cold air. The distant sound of a church bell, very far away, marking the hour, though he could not have said which hour it marked, the sound reaching him so attenuated by distance that it seemed less a sound than a memory of sound, an echo of something happening elsewhere, in another world separated from this one by space and circumstance. A light appeared in a cottage window that had previously been dark, the sudden illumination drawing his attention immediately, and he watched as the reflection formed in the water below, taking perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to reach its full brightness, the process visible as a gradual intensification, a gathering of light that seemed to well up from within the water itself before stabilizing into its final form. Someone inside the cottage moved past the window, a shadow crossing the newly established light, and then the figure paused, standing at the window for a moment, looking out toward the canal. He could see no details of the person, only the silhouette, the general outline that might have been a man or a woman, impossible to determine at this distance and in this light. The figure remained motionless for perhaps half a minute, then moved away from the window, disappearing back into the interior, leaving only the lamp's glow to mark the space where they had stood. He wondered what the person had been looking at, whether they had noticed him standing on the towpath, a solitary figure in the gathering darkness, or whether their gaze had simply been directed outward without focusing on anything particular, perhaps lost in thought, perhaps considering their own concerns with no awareness of the external world at all. It was possible, he thought, to look directly at something without truly seeing it, to let one's eyes rest upon a scene while one's mind occupied itself entirely with internal matters, and this seemed particularly likely at such an hour, when the day's work was done and the evening offered a brief interval for reflection before sleep claimed its own portion of time. The towpath ahead showed increasing signs of infrequent use. The surface became less even, with grass encroaching from the sides, narrowing the clear path to perhaps 3 feet in width. Small tufts of vegetation had established themselves in the middle of the track, suggesting that days or even weeks might pass without anyone walking this section, that he had progressed beyond the portion of the canal that served regular traffic, into a more neglected stretch where maintenance occurred only occasionally, where nature was gradually reclaiming what human activity had carved out. This did not concern him particularly, as the path remained passable and the growing darkness had not yet reached the point where he could not distinguish the ground from the vegetation, but it served as a reminder that he was moving away from inhabited areas, that soon he would need to make the decision he had been postponing, the choice to turn back while navigation remained relatively straightforward. Yet still he continued forward, his pace unchanged, the rhythm of his step steady and unhurried. The cold had intensified, but he found that by keeping his hands in his pockets and maintaining his gentle motion, the discomfort remained manageable, more an awareness of temperature than actual suffering. His body generated enough warmth through the act of walking to balance the air's chill, creating an equilibrium that could be sustained for some time yet before retreat became necessary. The night sky above had completed its transformation into darkness, the last traces of sunset having finally disappeared, leaving only the faint illumination that came from the cottage windows and their reflections to provide any sense of the landscape's features. A sound reached him from somewhere ahead, a splash followed by ripples that disturbed the water's surface, visible as undulations in the reflected light from a distant cottage window. Perhaps a fish had broken the surface, pursuing insects, or perhaps a water bird had landed, though he could see nothing in the darkness that would confirm either possibility. The ripples spread outward in expanding circles, deforming the reflections they encountered, stretching them and compressing them before the water gradually returned to stillness and the lights resumed their steady forms. The brief disruption seemed to emphasize the prevailing calm, making the subsequent quiet more noticeable by contrast, more complete in its restoration. The towpath widened again slightly, and he saw that he had reached a place where another narrow boat was moored, this one showing signs of longer-term occupation than the earlier vessel he had passed. A small vegetable garden had been established on the bank beside the boat, enclosed by a makeshift fence of wooden stakes and wire, and within this enclosure he could see the dark shapes of plants growing in orderly rows. Smoke rose from the boat's chimney, a thin vertical line that dispersed as it rose, and light glowed from the cabin windows, warm and inviting despite the cramped space it illuminated. This was someone's home, not merely a working vessel, and the care evident in the garden and the boat's maintained condition spoke of pride in this humble domestic arrangement, of the determination to make a livable space from the most modest of circumstances. He did not approach too closely, not wishing to intrude on the privacy of the boat's occupants, but as he passed at a respectful distance, he heard voices from within, two adults conversing in tones too low for him to distinguish words, the sounds carrying across the water with that peculiar clarity that water and evening quiet created together. A child's voice joined briefly, higher-pitched, animated, followed by an adult's gentle response, and then all three fell silent again, absorbed back into whatever occupied them within their narrow floating home. The scene possessed a quality of self-sufficiency that he found quietly moving, this small family making their life on the water, independent of the landlords and rent collectors who governed the lives of those in the cottages, free to move with the seasons and the demands of commerce, belonging nowhere and therefore, in some sense, belonging everywhere along the network of canals that threaded through the country. Beyond the moored boat, the cottages on the far bank had become so infrequent that perhaps 100 yards separated one dwelling from the next, and several showed no lights at all, their occupants either absent or retired to darkened rooms, conserving lamp oil, making do with whatever ambient light penetrated their windows from the stars that were now becoming visible overhead. The night sky had cleared considerably, he noticed, looking up for the first time in many minutes, and the stars showed with increasing brightness, puncturing the darkness with their distant illumination, reminding him of the scale beyond the immediate landscape, the vast emptiness within which this small canal and its bordering cottages existed as a minute thread of human presence, insignificant in cosmic terms yet containing within it all the hopes and struggles and quiet satisfactions of the families who made their lives along its banks. The temperature had dropped further still, and he became aware that his face had grown numb from the cold, that his ears stung slightly where the chill air reached them. The physical discomfort remained tolerable but was beginning to intrude more persistently on his awareness, suggesting that the time had indeed come to consider turning back, to begin the return journey that would take him along the same towpath he had followed outward, past the same cottages and locks and moored boats, though seeing them now from the opposite direction, under progressively darker conditions as true night established itself completely. Yet he found himself reluctant to make this turn, to acknowledge that the walk had reached its natural conclusion, that further progress would bring diminishing returns, would take him into darkness too complete for safe navigation without a lantern he did not possess. He stood for a moment in the deepening cold, looking ahead to where the towpath disappeared into darkness so complete that he could no longer distinguish its edges, could no longer see whether it continued straight or curved, whether it remained level or began to rise or fall. The uncertainty itself seemed to mark a natural boundary, a point beyond which continuation would require commitment of a different order, would transform the walk from a gentle evening perambulation into something more determined, more purposeful, and he recognized that he had no such purpose, that his presence here had been sustained entirely by the pleasure of observation, by the accumulation of small details that had held his attention through the gradual transition from day to night. The decision to turn back, once made, brought with it a slight sense of relief, though this was accompanied by an equally slight regret at leaving the forward progress unfinished, at not discovering what lay beyond the next bend, beyond the reach of his vision. But such feelings were familiar to him from other walks, other explorations, the inevitable tension between curiosity and prudence, between the desire to continue and the recognition of limits. He turned slowly, his boots finding purchase on the grass-invaded path, and began retracing his steps, his pace initially unchanged from the outward journey, though he suspected it might quicken somewhat as the cold worked more insistently against his body's attempts to maintain warmth. The perspective reversed itself immediately, and what had been ahead now lay behind, what had been approaching now receded. The same cottages that he had observed from one angle now presented themselves from another, their windows appearing in different relationships to each other, the spacing between them seeming altered though nothing had actually changed except his direction of movement. The moored narrow boat came into view again, its cabin lights still burning, its chimney still exhaling its thin line of smoke, and he noticed details he had missed on the outward passage, the way a rope had been coiled on the cabin roof, the presence of a small bucket hanging from a nail on the cabin's exterior wall, the careful positioning of a plank that served as a gangway from the boat to the bank. The reflections in the water now lay to his left rather than his right, though they remained essentially the same golden rectangles stretching down into the same dark depths, responding to the same minute movements of the water's surface. Yet seeing them from this reversed position gave them a slightly different character, made them seem somehow more distant, less immediate, as though the act of turning around had created a separation that viewing them while approaching had not produced. He could not account for this difference rationally, suspected it was merely a trick of perception, of expectation, yet the feeling persisted nonetheless, adding a faint note of melancholy to his progress, a sense that something had been lost in the turning, some quality of engagement that could not be recovered simply by retracing the same physical route. The lockkeeper's cottage appeared ahead, its windows still lit, its chimney still producing its steady column of smoke. As he drew closer, he saw that the lockkeeper himself had emerged again, standing near the upper gates with a lantern now, its light creating a small circle of illumination within which the man moved with practiced efficiency, checking something about the gate mechanism, making some adjustment or performing some routine maintenance that the evening's conclusion required. The lantern's light reflected in the locked chamber's water, creating a pool of brightness that seemed to float on the surface, and beyond this pool the darkness of the empty chamber appeared even more absolute by contrast, a void within which nothing could be distinguished. The walker passed the lock without interrupting the keeper's work, maintaining the same respectful distance and silence that had characterized their earlier brief encounter. The keeper glanced up, acknowledged his presence with a slight movement of his head, then returned his attention to whatever task occupied him. The lantern swung slightly as the keeper moved, and its light swept across the locked chamber's walls, revealing for a moment the wet stone, the dark growth that clung to surfaces below the waterline, the iron fittings that held the gate mechanisms in place. Then the light moved on, and the chamber returned to darkness, and the walker continued past, leaving the keeper to his solitary evening labors. The stretch of towpath beyond the lock seemed more familiar now, having been traversed once already, though the increasing darkness altered it sufficiently that recognition came more from memory than from actual visual confirmation. He knew that the bridge stood somewhere ahead, knew that beyond it the cottages resumed their denser arrangement, knew that eventually he would reach the point where he had first begun this walk, though the precise location of that starting point had become somewhat indefinite in his memory, one section of towpath being much like another, distinguished only by the specific arrangement of cottages and their windows, details that darkness was rapidly rendering indistinguishable. The cold had become more insistent, and he found himself walking slightly faster, not hurrying exactly, but allowing his pace to increase enough that his body generated more warmth, enough that the chill became manageable again rather than something requiring conscious endurance. His hands remained in his pockets, his shoulders had hunched slightly without his intending them to do so, and he recognized these as his body's automatic responses to temperature, adjustments made below the level of conscious thought, the organism protecting itself through small modifications of posture and movement. The increased pace altered the rhythm of the walk, made it feel less meditative, more purposeful, though he tried to resist this transformation, tried to maintain some of the observational quality that had characterized the outward journey. The bridge materialized from the darkness ahead, its arch visible as a slightly lighter area against the surrounding gloom, the bricks catching and holding some faint residual light from sources he could not identify. As he passed beneath it, the darkness intensified momentarily, the arch blocking even the faint illumination from the stars, creating a brief interval of near-complete blindness during which he relied entirely on memory and the feel of the path beneath his feet. Then he emerged on the far side, and the cottage windows ahead provided reference points again, their reflections creating the familiar pattern in the water, the double line of lights that marked the inhabited section of the canal. More windows were lit now than during his outward journey, nearly every cottage showing at least one source of illumination, and the collective effect was quite striking, a constellation of domestic lights that transformed the far bank into something almost festive, though he knew this impression arose from aesthetic appreciation rather than from any actual celebration occurring within those modest dwellings. The families inside were simply conducting their evening routines, preparing for bed, tending to the countless small tasks that domestic life required, their lamps burning because darkness had made artificial light necessary, not because any special occasion demanded it. A cottage that had been dark earlier now showed a lamp in its lower window, and through this window he could see, more clearly than had been possible with the others, the interior of the room beyond. A table stood near the window, and at this table sat a woman, her head bowed over what appeared to be needlework, her hands moving with slow precision as she worked. A child sat opposite her, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, the small head also bowed, attention focused on something on the table's surface, though what this might be he could not determine. The scene possessed a quality of concentrated quiet, of two people absorbed in their separate tasks yet sharing the same space, the same light, the same moment of domestic peace before sleep would separate them into individual rooms and dreams. He watched this scene for only a moment before continuing on, not wishing to transform observation into something that might be considered intrusive, might be felt by those observed as an unwelcome scrutiny. Yet the image remained with him as he walked, the mother and child at their table, the lamp illuminating their work, the quiet absorption that their posture suggested. It seemed to him a kind of ideal, this simple domestic tableau, free from the dramatic or the exceptional, containing nothing that would interest a painter or a storyteller, yet somehow capturing something essential about the texture of ordinary life, the way most hours were spent in quiet occupation rather than in crisis or celebration, in the steady rhythm of routine rather than in the disruptions that made one day memorable and different from another. The towpath continued its steady line ahead of him, and he continued his steady progress along it, his pace having settled into a rhythm slightly faster than his outward journey but still far from hurried, still maintaining enough deliberation that observation remained possible even in the diminished light. The cold wrapped around him now as a constant presence, no longer something he noticed particularly but simply the condition within which he moved, accepted and accommodated, requiring no special attention beyond the unconscious adjustments his body continued to make. His hands in his pockets had grown warm again from their confinement, and his face, though numb, no longer stung as it had earlier, having adapted to the temperature through whatever physiological processes govern such adaptations. The cottages passed to his left, their windows creating a rhythm of light and darkness, of golden reflection and black water, that seemed to pace his progress, to mark the distance he covered without requiring him to measure it in any more precise terms. He did not count the cottages, did not attempt to track his position along the canal with any exactitude, content to know simply that he was moving back toward his starting point, that each step brought him closer to whatever obligations awaited him there, whatever domestic space or social arrangement constituted his own life beyond these solitary hours of walking and observation. A door opened in one of the cottages, spilling light across the small patch of ground between the building and the water's edge, and a man stepped out, pausing on the threshold to button his coat before venturing fully into the cold evening air. The walker could see him clearly for a moment, illuminated from behind by the interior lamp, a figure of middle years wearing working clothes, the coat worn but serviceable, the cap pulled low against the chill. The man closed the door carefully behind him, reducing the spill of light to what escaped through the window, and then walked toward what must have been the privy at the rear of the property, his form becoming a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, moving with the unhurried gait of someone performing a routine task before retiring for the night. The walker continued past, the distance between him and the cottage sufficient that his presence would likely go unnoticed by the man attending to his evening necessities, and he felt a kind of gratitude for this separation, for the way the canal created a natural boundary between his observation and the lives he observed, allowing him to witness without intruding, to note without participating. The man disappeared behind an outbuilding, and a moment later the door of the cottage opened again briefly, admitting him back into the warmth and light, and then closed once more, sealing the interior away, returning the scene to its previous state of lit windows and quiet walls. The reflections had become, if anything, more vivid as the night deepened, the contrast between the illuminated rectangles and the surrounding darkness now so pronounced that the lights seemed to pulse with their own vitality, seemed almost to detach themselves from the cottages above and exist independently in the water below. He found his attention drawn more to these reflections than to their sources, found something more compelling in the way the water transformed solid light into liquid luminosity, in the way the slight movements of the surface created constant subtle variations in shape and intensity without destroying the essential form. The reflections were more beautiful than the windows themselves, he decided, more interesting because less static, more alive because less fixed. The path beneath his feet had returned to its earlier well-maintained condition, the grass no longer encroaching, the surface level and firm, suggesting he had re-entered the section where regular traffic justified regular upkeep. This observation was confirmed a moment later when he encountered another evening walker, the first person he had seen on the towpath itself since beginning his journey. This walker moved in the opposite direction, heading away from the town toward the darker stretches he himself had just left, and as they approached each other, both men shifted slightly to allow passage, the towpath being wide enough to accommodate them both if neither insisted on holding the center line. They nodded to each other in passing, a brief acknowledgement that required no words, no breaking of the silence that wrapped around them both. The other walker carried a lantern, its light bobbing with his stride, creating moving shadows that swept across the ground and caught briefly on the plants along the path's edge before moving on. The light illuminated the other man's face for a moment as they passed, showing a younger man, perhaps 30, with a beard and the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors, a bargeman perhaps, or a laborer from one of the nearby farms. Then the light moved past, and both men continued in their opposite directions, the encounter already complete, already fading into the accumulation of small moments that constituted the walk. The presence of the other walker reminded him that he was not alone in finding the canal path suitable for evening perambulation, that others too sought out this route for their own reasons, whether for practical travel between locations or for the same kind of quiet observation that had motivated his own journey. The towpath served multiple purposes, was both thoroughfare and destination, both means and end, and the various people who used it brought their own intentions, their own ways of seeing, their own relationships with the landscape through which it passed. Some might walk here daily and no longer notice the reflections in the water, the variations in the cottages, the subtle changes that occurred from season to season. Others might come rarely and find everything remarkable, worthy of attention. He suspected he fell somewhere between these extremes, familiar enough with the canal to feel comfortable here, yet not so habituated that observation had become automatic, unremarked. Another cottage window darkened as he watched, the light extinguished, the reflection disappearing immediately from the water below, leaving a gap in the pattern that had seemed so complete only moments before. Someone had blown out their lamp, had concluded their evening activities, had retired to bed to seek whatever rest the night would grant them. The darkness that reclaimed the window seemed deeper than before it had been lit, as though the light had somehow borrowed from the surrounding darkness while it burned, and now that debt was being repaid with interest, the absence more pronounced than if the window had never been illuminated at all. Yet the overall pattern remained strong, enough other windows still burning that the loss of one made little difference to the general impression of inhabited warmth along the canal's edge. His own weariness was beginning to make itself felt, not dramatically, not demanding immediate rest, but present as a gentle heaviness in his legs, a slight reluctance in his muscles to maintain their rhythm. He had been walking for perhaps an hour, possibly longer, having lost track of time in the way that solitary activity in unchanging conditions allowed, and while the physical exertion had been minimal, the cumulative effect of continuous gentle motion was making itself known. He did not mind this sensation particularly, found it rather satisfying, the evidence of effort expended, of distance covered, of body used for its intended purpose of movement through space. The canal stretched ahead in its familiar straight line, and he knew now that he could not be far from the point where he had begun, though the darkness made precise recognition difficult. The cottages here looked much like those he had passed earlier, showed the same architectural character, the same modest proportions, the same arrangement of windows and doors. Without the variations in lighting that had distinguished one dwelling from another during the outward journey, with full darkness having settled over the scene, individual cottages became harder to identify, merged into a general impression of repeated form, of pattern extended through space until it reached whatever point marked the transition from this neighborhood to the next. A cat crossed the towpath ahead of him, visible for only a moment as a low dark shape moving with quick purpose from the canal side to the field beyond, disappearing into the grass without sound, without leaving any trace of its passage except the brief visual impression registered by his eyes. The appearance of the cat seemed appropriate somehow, fitting for this hour when the diurnal world had yielded to the nocturnal, when the creatures of day had retreated and those of night had emerged to claim their territory. The cat belonged to this darkness in a way that he did not, possessed an ease with the absence of light that his human eyes and human instincts could not match, saw things in the gloom that remained invisible to him, navigated by senses that operated along different principles than his own. Another window darkened, and then another, the sequence continuing as households completed their evening routines and sought sleep. The pattern of lights that had seemed so stable, so permanent, revealed itself as temporary, a configuration that would persist only for the hour or two when lamps were needed, but waking hours continued, before dissolving entirely as sleep claimed the canal's inhabitants and darkness reclaimed its dominion. By midnight, he thought, perhaps only one or two windows would show light, marking households with sick children who required tending, or adults whose work schedules demanded waking hours that violated normal patterns, or simply individuals whose bodies rejected sleep and left them wakeful through the dark hours when most others rested. The temperature had stabilized at its low point, or perhaps his body had simply ceased registering further decreases, having adapted as fully as it could to the conditions. The cold remained present but no longer seemed to intensify, existing as a constant background condition that he had learned to accommodate, that no longer demanded his attention except when he thought deliberately about it, when he brought his awareness to bear on the physical sensations that surrounded him. His breath continued to form visible clouds, the moisture in his exhalations condensing in the cold air, and he watched these clouds form and dissipate, finding a kind of meditation in their rhythm, in the visual confirmation of his body's continued functioning, of the life processes that sustained him independent of his conscious will or intention. A light appeared on the towpath behind him, announcing the approach of another walker, and he glanced back to see a figure carrying a lantern, moving with a steady pace that suggested regular travel along this route. The light grew closer, and as it did, he could hear the footsteps, the slight scrape of boots on the packed earth, the occasional small sounds that accompanied human movement. The walker behind him was catching up, moving faster than his own pace, and he considered whether to step aside to allow easier passage or simply maintain his current position and let the other walker overtake him in whatever manner seemed appropriate. The decision was made for him when the approaching walker called out, a friendly greeting that carried clearly in the still air, asking permission to pass. He responded with an equally friendly acknowledgement and moved to the canal side of the path, giving the other walker room to move past on his right. As the man drew level, the lantern light illuminated both their faces, and he saw a working man, perhaps 40 years old, wearing a thick coat and carrying what appeared to be a small satchel, possibly someone returning home from a late shift or traveling to an early one. They exchanged brief pleasantries, comments about the cold, about the clearness of the night, nothing of substance but the small courtesies that people offer each other when their paths cross, the acknowledgement of shared humanity, of common experience of the evening and its conditions. Then the other walker continued on, his lantern light receding ahead, creating a moving pool of illumination that gradually diminished with distance, until it appeared as merely a point of brightness among all the other points of brightness along the canal. The walker who had passed him faded into the distance, his lantern eventually turning from the towpath, presumably toward one of the cottages or perhaps onto a side path that led elsewhere, and the light disappeared entirely, absorbed into one of the dwellings or simply moving beyond the range where his eyes could distinguish it from the general darkness. The silence returned in the wake of this brief encounter, settling back over the canal with the same completeness it had possessed before, as though the exchange of greetings had been merely a temporary interruption, a ripple on the surface of the evening's prevailing stillness. He found himself alone again on the towpath, surrounded by the now familiar configuration of lit windows and their reflections, of dark water and darker sky, of the subtle gradations of shadow that distinguished cottage from field from distant tree line. The solitude felt different now, having been briefly interrupted, felt more chosen somehow, more deliberately sought, as though the contrast with company had clarified the value of being alone, had made apparent the particular quality of experience that solitary walking provided. When one walked alone, the internal monologue could continue uninterrupted, the observations could accumulate without needing to be articulated, the pace could adjust itself to mood and inclination without requiring negotiation with another person's preferences or capabilities. The cottages had begun to thin again, though in a different way than they had at the furthest extent of his outward journey. Here the spacing between buildings suggested not a transition to countryside but rather a different kind of settlement pattern, perhaps indicating the approach to a slightly more prosperous area where larger properties allowed for greater separation between dwellings, or perhaps marking the edge of a different administrative district where planning regulations had produced different results. Whatever the cause, the effect was to create longer stretches of darkness between the islands of light, to make each illuminated window more distinct, more singular in its presence. One cottage that stood somewhat apart from its neighbors showed an unusual amount of activity for the late hour, with lights burning in both the lower and upper windows and shadows moving across them frequently, suggesting multiple people moving between rooms or engaged in tasks that required motion. As he watched, the front door opened and a figure emerged, wrapped in a shawl, and hurried across the small yard toward the privy, moving with the quick steps of someone who wished to complete their business and return to warmth as rapidly as possible. The door closed behind this figure, and a moment later another person appeared in the lit window, looking out briefly before drawing the curtain more completely closed, reducing the light's escape to a thin line at the curtain's edge. He wondered what circumstances kept this household wakeful when so many others had already retired, whether illness demanded attention, whether some domestic crisis required resolution, whether perhaps a social gathering extended beyond the usual hours, though this last seemed unlikely given the modest character of the dwelling and the working-class neighborhood in which it stood. More probably, he thought, someone was unwell, a child perhaps, requiring the kind of vigilant care that kept parents wakeful through the night, attending to needs that could not be postponed, administering whatever remedies their circumstances and knowledge permitted. The thought brought a moment of empathy, an awareness of the struggles that unfolded behind these modest walls, struggles he could only infer from external signs, from the patterns of light and movement that provided glimpses without revealing the full story. The path curved slightly, following the canal's adjustment to some feature of the landscape, and as he rounded this curve, he saw ahead of him a stretch of water that he recognized with certainty, knew he had observed at the beginning of his walk. A particular cottage stood at an angle to its neighbors, a tree grew close to the towpath's edge, creating a distinctive silhouette against the sky, and the arrangement of windows in a cluster of 3 buildings created a pattern he recalled noticing earlier. This recognition brought with it the awareness that his walk was indeed nearing its conclusion, that the circular journey would soon complete itself, returning him to whatever point he had designated, consciously or unconsciously, as his starting place. The anticipation of arrival began to shift his experience of the walk, introducing an element of conclusion that altered the timeless quality the middle portions had possessed. Now he walked with destination in mind, with the awareness that each step brought him closer to the end of this particular interval of observation and solitude, that soon he would need to transition back into whatever other modes of being his life required, whatever social roles or domestic obligations waited to reclaim his attention. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, a change in the quality of his awareness that accompanied the change in his relationship to the landscape through which he moved. Yet he tried to resist this shift, tried to maintain the observational attention that had characterized the earlier portions of the walk, tried to remain present to the details that continued to surround him even as the walk moved toward its end. The reflections in the water remained beautiful, the cottage windows remained warm in their glow, the darkness remained profound in its depth, and these qualities deserved attention regardless of whether he stood at the beginning, middle, or end of his journey. The value of observation, he reminded himself, lay not in novelty but in the quality of attention brought to bear, and this quality could be maintained even when viewing scenes that had become familiar, even when retracing ground already covered. A final cottage window darkened as he watched, this one in a building that stood almost directly across from where he now walked, close enough that he could hear, very faintly, the sound of the lamp being extinguished, the small decisive exhalation of breath that preceded the darkness. The reflection disappeared from the water immediately, and he paused for a moment, watching the space where it had been, seeing how the darkness filled it completely, how no trace remained of the light that had occupied that space only moments before. It seemed a small death, this extinguishing, a tiny cessation that prefigured the larger cessation that awaited all living things, the final darkness that would eventually claim every consciousness, every perception, every accumulation of memory and experience that constituted an individual existence. But such thoughts, he recognized, were products of the late hour, of the cold, of the solitude and the darkness pressing close. They were not unwelcome thoughts, but neither did they require dwelling upon, and he allowed them to pass through his mind without attachment, without the need to develop them into fuller philosophical speculation. The evening was for observation, for the simple noting of what presented itself to the senses, not for abstract reasoning or metaphysical inquiry. Those modes of thought had their place, but that place was not here, not now, not on a cold towpath beside a Victorian canal as evening deepened into night. He resumed walking, his pace unchanged, his attention returning to the immediate details of his surroundings. The water continued its gentle lapping against the banks, the cottages continued their patient standing in their ordered rows, the reflections continued their wavering presence in the dark surface below. Everything persisted in its being despite his momentary inward turn, indifferent to his thoughts, continuing according to principles that operated entirely independently of his observation or interpretation. There was something comforting in this independence, in the recognition that the world did not require his attention to exist, that it carried on with perfect adequacy whether observed or unobserved, whether interpreted or left unmarked by human meaning. The tree he had noted earlier now stood immediately ahead, its bare branches creating an intricate pattern against the sky, and he passed beneath it, hearing the faint whisper of air moving through the upper reaches, carrying the smell of bark and soil and the accumulated organic matter that surrounded its roots. The tree had likely stood here longer than the canal, had witnessed the excavation of the waterway, had seen the construction of the cottages, had marked the passage of decades through the slow incremental changes that constituted its own life, the adding of growth rings, the seasonal cycle of leaves appearing and falling, the gradual expansion of its root system beneath the ground. It would likely stand here long after he had passed, after the current occupants of the cottages had been replaced by others, after countless evening walks had traced the path he now followed. The cottage that stood at an odd angle came into view fully now, and with it, the recognition that he had returned to his approximate starting point, that the walk had completed its circuit, that what remained was merely the final transition from the towpath to whatever street or path would carry him back to his own dwelling or wherever his evening needed to take him next. He felt no particular triumph at this return, no sense of accomplishment, merely the quiet satisfaction of having spent an hour or more in gentle observation, of having allowed himself the luxury of unhurried attention to a landscape that most people passed through without truly seeing, hurrying along the towpath on their way to specific destinations, their minds occupied with the concerns that awaited them rather than with the details of the journey itself. He paused at what he had decided was his stopping point, turning to look back along the canal one final time, seeing the line of light stretching away into the distance, fewer now than at the height of the evening but still sufficient to mark the presence of human habitation, of lives continuing in their domestic rhythms behind those modest walls. The scene would persist after he left, would continue through the night as more lamps were extinguished and sleep claimed the neighborhood, would be there again tomorrow evening when the process repeated itself, the same pattern of illumination and darkness playing out with small variations, with different households lighting lamps at different times, with the constant subtle changes that characterized any living landscape while leaving its essential character unchanged. The cold had worked its way more deeply into him during his final pause, and he felt it now as a stiffness in his joints, a reluctance in his muscles to resume movement after their brief stillness. He stamped his feet once, twice, hearing the hollow sound against the packed earth, feeling the blood pushed back into circulation, the temporary warmth that such action generated. His hands he withdrew from his pockets, flexing the fingers that had grown rigid despite their confinement, watching them move in the faint light that reached this far from the nearest cottage window, noting the way they responded to his will, slowly at first, then with increasing ease as the movement itself restored their facility. He turned away from the canal then, leaving the towpath by a narrow path that led between two cottages, a public right-of-way that would bring him to the street beyond. As he moved away from the water's edge, the character of the scene changed immediately, the reflections disappearing from view, the perspective shifting from horizontal expanses to the vertical presence of buildings on either side. The path between the cottages was darker than the towpath had been, sheltered from whatever ambient light the sky provided, enclosed by brick walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little illumination reached them. He moved carefully, feeling his way as much as seeing it, his boots finding stones and uneven spots that required attention, that demanded the kind of cautious progress he had not needed on the more familiar towpath. The passage between the cottages took perhaps 30 seconds to traverse, though in the darkness and the concentration required for safe footing, it felt longer. Then he emerged onto the street beyond, a narrow lane that ran parallel to the canal, lined on one side by the fronts of the cottages whose backs he had been observing all evening, and on the other by a low stone wall that marked the boundary of some property or field. The street was cobbled, the stones worn smooth by decades of foot traffic and cart wheels, and the sound of his boots changed as he stepped onto this harder surface, becoming sharper, more defined, each step announcing itself with a clarity that the earth of the towpath had muffled. The street lamps here burned with a steadier light than the cottage windows, their gas flames enclosed in glass housings that protected them from wind while allowing the light to spread in broader pools along the pavement. These lamps stood at intervals of perhaps 30 yards, creating circles of illumination separated by stretches of deeper shadow, and he walked from one pool to the next, his figure alternately illuminated and obscured as he progressed along the street. The contrast between the lit areas and the dark ones was pronounced, and his eyes required a moment to adjust each time he moved from one to the other, the pupils contracting in the brightness, then dilating again in the shadow, the constant adjustment creating a mild strain that made him aware of his eyes functioning in a way that the more uniform darkness of the canal had not required. Other sounds intruded here that the towpath's isolation had excluded. The distant clatter of a cart on some other street, the sound of voices from inside a building, a dog barking several streets away, the various acoustic markers of human settlement that indicated proximity to the denser parts of the town. These sounds did not disturb him particularly, but they marked the transition from the canal's relative solitude to the more populated areas where his evening walk would properly end, where he would rejoin the social world with its various demands and expectations. The transition was gradual but unmistakable, each step taking him further from the quiet observation of reflections and cottage windows, bringing him closer to whatever obligations awaited. A figure appeared ahead, walking toward him on the same pavement, and as they approached each other beneath one of the street lamps, he saw an elderly woman, wrapped in several layers of clothing against the cold, moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints protested movement, whose body no longer granted the easy mobility of youth. She carried a small bundle, perhaps washing or mending collected from one of the households where she worked, and she nodded to him as they passed, a brief acknowledgement that required no response beyond his own slight inclination of the head. Then she continued on her way, and he on his, two people whose paths had intersected for only a moment, who knew nothing of each other beyond the simple fact of their simultaneous presence on this street at this hour. The street began to widen, transitioning from the narrow lane into something more substantial, and the buildings on either side grew taller, showing 3 stories rather than 2, their architecture suggesting commercial premises on the ground floors with living quarters above. A few windows showed lights, but most were dark, the shops having closed hours earlier, their proprietors having retreated to their domestic spaces or departed to homes elsewhere. The street here showed more signs of daytime activity, the cobbles more worn, the gutters showing evidence of the constant traffic that flowed through during business hours, though now, in the late evening, very few people moved along the pavement, and those who did walked with purpose, heads down against the cold, intent on reaching their destinations. He recognized this street, knew it as one of the minor thoroughfares that connected different neighborhoods, that served as a conduit for the movement of people and goods without being significant enough to merit major civic attention or improvement. The buildings showed their age in the same way the canal cottages had, through settled rooflines and repaired brickwork, through the accumulation of small modifications that responded to changing needs and circumstances. A tobacconist's shop stood dark behind its shuttered windows, a bakery showed its ovens cold and silent behind the counter, a greengrocer's displayed empty boxes stacked outside the door, waiting for tomorrow's delivery that would fill them again with produce for sale. His own lodgings lay perhaps another quarter-mile along this street and then down 2 turnings, in a building not unlike those he now passed, a modest structure that housed several tenants in separate rooms, each maintaining their own small domestic establishment, sharing the communal spaces according to the informal protocols that govern such arrangements. He anticipated the return to his room with mixed feelings, glad for the warmth it would provide but already slightly nostalgic for the walk he was leaving behind, for the simple act of observation that had filled the past hour with a quality of attention that his ordinary routines rarely permitted. The walk had been what he needed without knowing he needed it, an interval of quiet perception that had restored something he had not realized was depleted. The temperature seemed to have dropped even further, or perhaps his body, having ceased its gentle activity, was feeling the cold more acutely now that he walked with purpose rather than meditation. His breath came in larger clouds, his hands had retreated back into his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward in the instinctive attempt to reduce the surface area exposed to the chill air. Other people he passed showed the same posture, the same withdrawal into their clothing, the same quick steps that suggested a desire to reach shelter as rapidly as dignity and safe footing permitted. The evening had fully transitioned into night, and the night's cold had established itself with the authority that late autumn possessed, the reminder that winter approached with its harsher demands, its longer darkness, its more intense challenges to comfort and warmth. A public house stood on the corner ahead, its windows showing warm light and the suggestion of activity within, the sound of voices and laughter escaping each time the door opened to admit or release a patron. The smell of beer and pipe smoke drifted into the street, mixing with the general urban odors of coal smoke and horse manure and the various effluvia that accumulated in any densely inhabited area. Several men stood outside the establishment, smoking pipes and conversing in the loud, emphatic manner that suggested they had already consumed a substantial quantity of ale, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air, their laughter punctuating the conversation with regular eruptions that seemed disproportionate to whatever comments had provoked them. He passed the public house without slowing, having no desire to enter, to subject himself to the noise and crowd and smoke that characterized such establishments at this hour. Some people sought out such environments precisely for those qualities, finding in the warmth and company and slight disorder a relief from the constraints of work and domestic propriety, but he had never felt the attraction himself, preferring quieter forms of recreation, solitary pursuits that allowed for contemplation rather than demanding social performance. The walk he had just completed represented his preferred mode of leisure, the gentle accumulation of observation and thought that required no conversation, no negotiation with others' preferences, no maintenance of the social facades that public gatherings demanded. The two turnings that would take him to his lodgings appeared ahead, marked by slightly narrower streets that branched off from the main thoroughfare. He took the first of these, leaving behind the commercial district with its shuttered shops and scattered public houses, entering a purely residential area where the buildings stood silent and dark, their occupants already retired or at least withdrawn into private spaces where their activities remained invisible to anyone passing in the street. The pavement here was less well maintained, showing cracks and uneven spots that required attention, and the street lamps were spaced more widely, creating longer intervals of shadow between the pools of gaslight. The street in which his lodging stood appeared after the second turning, revealing itself as a row of terraced houses that presented an unbroken facade of brick to the pavement, each dwelling distinguished from its neighbors only by slight variations in the color of the paint around the windows, by the condition of the small iron railings that bordered the areas before the basement windows, by the different styles of door knockers that marked each entrance. His own building stood near the middle of the row, its front door painted a dark green that appeared almost black in the limited light, its windows showing no illumination except for a single lamp burning in the ground floor hallway, visible through the fanlight above the door, left burning by the landlady to guide tenants home at whatever hour they might return. He climbed the 3 steps to the front door, feeling for the key in his pocket, his fingers awkward from the cold, fumbling slightly with the mechanism before achieving the alignment that allowed the lock to turn. The door opened onto a narrow hallway that ran the length of the building, its walls covered in faded wallpaper whose pattern had long since ceased to be distinguishable, its floor laid with linoleum that showed the wear of countless footsteps. The lamp burning on the small table near the stairs cast a weak light that barely reached the hallway's far end, creating shadows in the corners that seemed to gather and pool like liquid darkness. The air inside was warmer than outside but not by much, the building's heating being minimal, relying primarily on whatever fires the individual tenants maintained in their own rooms, with only residual warmth escaping into the common areas. He closed the door quietly behind him, not wishing to disturb the other tenants who might already be sleeping, and stood for a moment in the hallway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the interior dimness, allowing his body to register the change in temperature, the transition from the open air of the streets to the enclosed atmosphere of the building. His boots carried traces of the towpath's earth, and he paused to scrape them against the mat that lay just inside the door, removing what mud and moisture he could before proceeding further, a courtesy to the landlady who took pride in maintaining cleanliness in the common areas despite the constant traffic of multiple households. The stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended to the second floor where his room was located, each step producing its own particular sound, a familiar sequence of notes that marked his progress upward. The sounds of other tenants' lives reached him faintly through the walls and doors, the murmur of conversation from one room, the cough of someone perhaps struggling with the bronchial complaints that plagued so many during the colder months, the settling creak of floorboards as someone moved about their chamber. These sounds represented the reality of lodging-house life, the proximity to strangers, The thin walls that preserved privacy only imperfectly, the constant awareness of others living their separate lives in adjacent spaces. His own door stood at the end of the second-floor corridor, the last room on the right, a position that granted him slightly more quiet than the rooms closer to the stairs, though it meant a longer walk through the building's poorly lit passages. He unlocked this door and entered the familiar space, reaching immediately for the matches he kept on the small table just inside, striking one and touching it to the wick of the oil lamp that provided his room's illumination. The flame caught and spread, growing stronger as the wick absorbed the oil, and the room emerged from darkness into the warm golden light that he had been observing in reflections all evening, though now experienced from within rather than viewed from without. The room was modest by any standard, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window that looked out onto the backyard and the rear of the houses on the next street. The furnishings consisted of a narrow bed, a small table with a single chair, a washstand with its basin and pitcher, and a wardrobe that held his few articles of clothing. A small fireplace occupied one wall, but he had not laid a fire before leaving that evening, and the grate stood empty and cold, filled only with the ash from previous fires, the accumulated residue of warmth consumed and exhausted. He would not light a fire now, he decided, despite the cold that still clung to him. The hour was too late, the effort too great for the brief benefit he would receive before retiring to bed, where blankets would serve adequately to maintain warmth through the night. He removed his coat, hanging it on the peg behind the door, then sat on the edge of the bed to remove his boots, feeling the relief in his feet as the constriction eased, as the leather that had held them firm throughout the walk released its pressure. His socks showed damp patches where moisture had seeped through the boot leather, and he removed these as well, hanging them over the chair back to dry, noting the redness of his feet where the cold had affected circulation, where the constraint of the boots had left its marks. The process of undressing continued methodically, each article of clothing removed and placed in its accustomed location, the routine so familiar that it required almost no conscious thought, the body moving through its sequence of actions while the mind remained partially elsewhere, still processing the impressions of the evening's walk. Once prepared for bed, wearing the simple nightshirt that served for sleeping, he extinguished the lamp, not wishing to waste oil, and moved to the window, drawing aside the thin curtain to look out into the darkness beyond. The view showed very little, the yard below invisible in the night's blackness, the windows of the houses opposite mostly dark, with only one or two showing faint light. The scene possessed none of the beauty of the canal reflections, none of the visual interest that had sustained his attention during the walk, yet it held a different kind of value, the familiar sight that marked home, that indicated the boundary of his private domain, that separated the external world of streets and canals and observed lives from the internal world of his own room, his own thoughts, his own solitary existence. He released the curtain and turned toward the bed, feeling his way in the darkness that was broken only by the faint light seeping under the door from the hallway lamp below. The bed received him with the comfort of familiarity, the mattress settling under his weight in patterns worn by months of use, the blankets providing their layered warmth as he drew them up to his shoulders, creating a small enclosure of heat within the room's larger coldness. His body, tired from the walk and the cold, relaxed gradually into the horizontal position, the muscles releasing their tension, the joints settling into rest, the various minor discomforts of prolonged activity making themselves briefly known before subsiding into the general background sensation of fatigue. The sounds of the building continued around him, muffled by walls and distance but still present, still marking the persistence of other lives continuing their own rhythms. Someone on the floor above walked across their room, the footsteps clear in the ceilings creaking. Someone on his own floor coughed repeatedly, a harsh sound that suggested illness or at least severe irritation of the lungs. A door closed somewhere, the sound carrying through the building structure. A voice spoke briefly, too indistinct for the words to be understood, receiving no audible response. These sounds created a kind of ambient texture to the silence, preventing it from being absolute, maintaining the awareness of community even in isolation, of proximity even in separation. His thoughts drifted back to the canal, to the reflections he had watched, to the slow progression along the towpath, to the various details that had captured his attention during the walk. The memories were already beginning to soften, to lose their precise edges, to transform from immediate perception into recollection, that filtered version of experience that memory always produced. Yet the essential quality remained, the sense of having spent time well, of having attended to the world with care, of having allowed observation to fill consciousness without the intrusion of analysis or interpretation, simply noting what appeared without immediate need to understand or explain. The cold had followed him into the bed despite the blankets, and he curled slightly, drawing his knees up, making himself smaller to conserve warmth, a position that felt both comfortable and vaguely childlike, a return to an earlier mode of sleeping that his adult body remembered and welcomed. The temperature would moderate as his body heat accumulated beneath the covers, as the small space between blanket and sheet warmed to match his body's temperature, creating that enclosed microclimate within which sleep became possible even on the coldest nights. He could feel this warming beginning, the gradual spread of comfort replacing the initial shock of cold fabric against skin. His breathing slowed, deepened, falling into the rhythm that preceded sleep, that marked the transition from waking consciousness to whatever altered states would follow. His thoughts became less directed, more associative, images from the evening's walk mixing with unrelated memories, with fragments of conversations from earlier days, with concerns about tomorrow's obligations that surfaced briefly before dissolving again into the general drift toward unconsciousness. The distinction between being awake and being asleep blurred, the boundary becoming permeable, allowing consciousness to slip back and forth across it with increasing frequency until finally, without clear demarcation, sleep claimed him entirely. The room continued its existence around his sleeping form, the lamp in the hallway below continuing to burn, the sounds of the building continuing their quiet pattern, the night outside continuing its slow progression toward dawn. The canal, miles away now, lay dark beneath its sky, its reflections reduced to starlight where no cottage windows still burned, its surface holding the depths in silence, waiting for morning to bring the bargemen back to their vessels, the workers back to their paths, the walkers back to their observations of light and water and the modest homes that lined its banks. Thank you for allowing yourself these peaceful moments as you drift off to sleep. If this gentle walk along the Victorian Canal gave you some peace, perhaps you might consider revisiting it another evening. And if you'd like to leave a comment, even just a single word describing where you listened this evening, we'd be happy to know. But these are just kind suggestions, not obligations. The most important thing is that you get a good rest, that your sleep is deep and restful, and that you feel refreshed tomorrow. Good night.